The first major misunderstanding when it comes to dealing with Islam is the word Islam. Now, you all know that it means submission, but we're not talking about the etymological definition. Islam is usually taken to mean one or more of many things. It could be the history of Muslims in Islamic countries. It could be the various cultures in the world of Islam. It's the way Muslims behave. But first and foremost, we need to consider Islam to be the Quran and Muhammad. It's that simple. It's the belief system. And the problem with understanding that people have is that they confuse the belief system with people, Muslims. Muslims can behave in any which way, but the belief system does not change. And so when we talk about Islam, and we need to get this to other people when we talk about them, is that Islam, when we say Islam, we mean the Quran and Muhammad. And that's it. And this has very serious consequences in the sense, the following sense. Well, first let me back up just a second. You're all perhaps familiar with certain moderate Muslims like Tariq Fatah, right? He came out with a statement in an article, not long ago. He says, the title of his article was, "Here's the Real War Within Islam." What did he mean by that? When he uses the word Islam, he's not talking about the Quran and Muhammad. There is no war about that, unfortunately. He's talking about the world of Islam. There are Muslims who are against and for jihadism, but he, like other moderate Muslims, never talk about the Quran and Muhammad. And there's, of course, the celebrity moderate Muslim everybody knows, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who wrote his autobiography entitled Battle for the Soul of Islam. Now, he didn't mean battle for the soul of the Quran and Muhammad. He never talks about the Quran and Muhammad. He's talking about Muslims as people. Some are violent and some are not violent. So he's also conflating the belief system with the people. We need to stop doing that. We need to talk only about the belief system. And the reason why that is so important is because it's the belief system that is taught in all of the mosques. So the belief system will always produce a great number of Muslims who take it seriously. And that's why we have to, when we talk about Islam, let everybody know that what you're really talking about is the Quran and Muhammad. Now, everybody knows that there are moderate Muslims, obviously, but there is no such thing as moderate Islam. And we need to make that clear to people also. Islam is the Quran and Muhammad, and it cannot be either moderate or immoderate. In fact, there's this very famous saying by Erdogan from Turkey, who said there's no such thing as moderate Islam, that the very concept is ugly. Islam cannot be either moderate or immoderate. It is what it is. Islam is Islam, and that's it. Well, this is one of the strongest leaders, Muslim leaders in the world. He knows what he's talking about. What is he referring to when he says Islam can be neither moderate nor immoderate? Well, he's obviously referring to the Quran and Muhammad, the belief system. He didn't say so, but that's it. Because Muslims as people, they can be moderate, they can be peaceful, but those are the ones who are not following the Quran and Muhammad. There's another quotation by a former leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Bassem Khafagi, who said, "I was the first to expose the notion of so-called moderate Islam," he put it in quotes, which is used as a means to canonize a non-Islamic Islam. Now get that, a non-Islamic Islam. What in the world is that? Well, what he's talking about with Islamic, he means the Quran and Muhammad. And so a non-Islamic Islam would be Muslims who practice Islam without following the directives in the Quran and Muhammad. That's what he's talking about. And so he says this so-called moderation means a violation of the laws of Islam. So that is pretty clear. He's talking about the belief system. And that's why when we talk to people, we have to be very clear that we're talking about the belief system and not how Muslims behave or don't behave. Now, moderate Islam then is really nothing more than a deviation from Islam, Islam being the Quran and Muhammad. You're all familiar with Bosch Fawston, I assume. He's the cartoonist who won the prize in the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest. He came out with a very good statement the other day. He said that moderate Muslims, the main thing that otherwise impotent moderate Muslims do for Islam is that they discourage otherwise honest and knowledgeable people from condemning Islam. Again, Islam being the Quran and Muhammad. And so these moderate Muslims create false hopes in people that they represent a viable form of Islam, the belief system, when they don't even talk about the belief system. And of course, they don't represent any viable form at all. They are, in fact, rejected by their Muslim communities. Both Tariq Fatah and Zuhdi Jasser have told us that they have no support in the Muslim communities, because what they are vaguely advocating, without actually saying it specifically, is a reform of the Quran and Muhammad, and of course they can't do that. And in fact, I remember a debate that Dr. Jasser had with the imam of a mosque in Tempe, and it started out where the imam asked Dr. Jasser, do you believe that the Quran is Allah's literal word? And Jasser said, yes, of course. That was the end of the debate. There's nothing more to debate after that. If you're not going to question the Quran, there's nothing more to debate. Now, if you turn to page 2 in your handout for a moment, let's talk about that. You see a triangle. It's kind of a schematic version, how to divide up the Muslim community. This is the version that we are all given by the media. At the top, you've got this tiny minority of violent extremists, as they're called, and that, of course, includes those organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Taliban, and so on. And then, presumably, everybody else below that tip of the triangle, everybody else is presumably moderate, because they're not going around blowing people up, shooting them and cutting their heads off and immolating them and crucifying them and what else. And so people who don't do that are considered to be moderates by the ignorant non-Muslims. The problem with that politically correct division of the Muslim community, we will then see on page 3. You look at the diagram on page 3. Considering all of these non- or unviolent Muslims to be moderate blinds us to the hundreds of millions of Muslims who share the same goals as the violent extremists, namely the establishment of a worldwide Islamic empire called the Caliphate. Same goals. Their methods of going about it are different, depending on the conditions. The Muslims, as minorities in non-Muslim countries, cannot afford to be violent because they would be crushed. And so they go about their subversive actions, infiltrating the institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is what we have to get across to people, that these so-called moderate Muslims are not moderate at all, the ones that they think are moderate, simply because they're not cutting people's heads off. The entire Muslim Brotherhood is the middle part of the triangle, but they are as aggressive, just not as violent, as the rest of them. In fact, the violent extremists are all offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, there are lots of conservatives who have been infected by the diagram on page 2. Among them are Dennis Prager even. All these people are on our sides, but they will not acknowledge that Islam itself is the problem. They think that, well, political Islam or militant Islam and so on, we'll be talking about those terms in a minute. Dennis Prager's only one. Hugh Hewitt, Bill O'Reilly, Megan Kelly, Michael Medved. Just last week, Michael Medved had on his show, I don't know whether anyone heard that, this woman, Karen Armstrong, who's a first-class liar and propagandist for Islam, who said on his show that there's nothing in the Quran which would justify what the extremists are doing, the violent extremists. And he didn't have the knowledge to contradict her. The fact that he had her on the program in the first place showed that he did not understand what Islam was all about. You're all familiar, of course, with what Ben Carson said about Islam a few weeks ago, that Islam is not compatible with our Constitution, not compatible with democracy. Michael Medved was one of the first people to attack Carson for saying that. So we have to get to these conservative journalists. I don't know what their email addresses are or their Facebook, maybe you do. Maybe you have a way of getting to them and explaining to them the chart on page 3 is the accurate division here, and that Islam itself is the problem. Has anyone read Glenn Beck's new book? Remember the title? It is, in capital letters, it is about Islam. That was very brave of him to do that, because the title alone tells us the nature of the problem. It is about Islam. It is not about various types of Islam. Again, Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. And so that's what it is all about, because that's where the entire problem comes from.